I thought we were celebrating. I had spent 3 hours that evening making his favorite dinner: pan-seared salmon with lemon butter sauce, roasted asparagus glistening with olive oil and sea salt, a bottle of Burgundy I had been saving since the year we got married. I had even put on the blue dress he once said made my eyes look like warm honey, the one I kept at the back of the wardrobe for occasions that deserved it. I had set the table with the good plates, lit 2 candles, and stood in the kitchen doorway feeling something close to joy. I thought we were marking the biggest moment of our 9-year marriage, the $190,000 bonus that was supposed to change everything, to give us breathing room, to turn the vague future plans we whispered about into something real and solid and ours. I had no idea that the money was already gone. I had no idea it had been quietly redirected 3 months earlier into an account I had never heard of, signed over to a woman who had been sitting across from me at Sunday lunches for 9 years with a smile as thin and careful as a paper cut. I found out not from Marcus, not from any honest, stumbling conversation over that good wine. I found out from a single transfer receipt that slipped out of a home improvement magazine he had left on the kitchen counter, as though it were nothing, as though $190,000 disappearing from our joint savings account into his mother's name were nothing more than a stray coupon, a shopping list, something to be tidied away before dinner. And the worst part, the part that kept me awake for weeks after, was that the receipt was dated October 14th, 3 months before I found it. 3 months of him kissing me goodbye at the door every morning. 3 months of shared meals, shared bed, shared life. 3 months of looking directly into my eyes and saying absolutely nothing. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the version of our life I still believed in that December morning. The version where I was still, in all the ways that mattered, happy. My name is Claire Hargreaves, though I have since taken back my maiden name, a decision that felt less like an act of anger and more like returning to a version of myself I had been slowly losing. Marcus and I met at 26 at a work conference that neither of us had wanted to attend. He was standing at the edge of the canapes, looking deeply unconvinced by everything, and I had walked over because he looked exactly the way I felt, and within 40 minutes we had abandoned the conference entirely and were sitting in the hotel bar talking about everything: books, cities, the particular loneliness of being the kind of person who takes things seriously in a world that mostly doesn't. I remember thinking, this is someone I could build something real with. That thought, it turns out, was both the truest and most expensive thing I ever felt. We married at 31 in a small ceremony in the countryside, 27 guests, autumn light, my father crying at the end of the aisle in the way he always did at anything that mattered. Marcus's mother, Diane, wore a cream dress that was close enough to white to be a statement, and smiled at everyone with the polished warmth of someone who had prepared extensively for being photographed. She made a speech that was technically about us, but spent 4 of its 6 minutes on Marcus, on the boy he had been, the man he had become, the sacrifices she had made. I smiled through all of it. I was good at smiling through things. It was, I see now, one of my least useful skills. Our house on Aldermore Lane was everything I had ever wanted in the clumsy, specific way that people want things they haven't articulated to themselves yet. It was a narrow Victorian terrace with original cornicing, a cast-iron fireplace in the front room, and a garden that was mostly chaos and old roses. We had stretched our budget to buy it, and I had insisted, quietly, gently, but firmly, that both our names go on the deed. Marcus had agreed without complaint. "Of course," he said, and signed where the solicitor pointed, and I had felt a small private relief that I didn't examine too closely. There was an instinct in me even then. I should have listened to it more carefully. I worked as a senior operations manager for a logistics company. the kind of job that sounds dull until you understand that it means holding together a supply chain that feeds a dozen major retailers, managing a team of 14, making decisions that cost or save real money. I was proud of that in the way that feels private and important. Not the loud pride of people who announce their achievements, but the quiet kind, the kind that keeps you steady when things get difficult. Marcus worked in investment management, the kind of firm where bonuses are whispered about in hushed, reverential tones. He was steady and analytical, and very good at the parts of his job that required patience and precision. Together, we earned well, and we had built the joint savings account, the emergency fund, over 6 years of careful, deliberate depositing. By the autumn before everything fell apart, that account held just over $190,000. It was our foundation. It was what I meant when I thought about our future. Diane had been an ambient presence in our marriage since the beginning. Never fully intrusive, but never fully absent either. She called Marcus every Sunday between 10 and 10:15, a ritual as fixed as church. She visited every few months with casserole dishes and opinions distributed in roughly equal measure, and her opinion of me had always been delivered in the particular language of polite women who disapprove of things they cannot openly criticize. A fractional pause before a compliment, a question about my plans that managed to imply both nosiness and doubt in the same breath, a habit of addressing the majority of her remarks to Marcus even when I had just spoken. Once, in our 3rd year of marriage, she said to him, with me standing 3 feet away, that she worried he worked too hard for someone else's goals. She did not look at me when she said it. I had mentioned this to Marcus afterward, and he had done what he always did, minimized it with such practiced gentleness that I had walked away, feeling slightly ashamed for having brought it up. "She just worries," he said. "She doesn't mean anything by it. You know how she is." And I did know how she was. I had cataloged exactly how she was. In careful mental notes I kept, but never quite acted on, tucking each small incident away, like pressed flowers in a book I never opened. The autumn before the bonus payout, I noticed that the Sunday calls had expanded. Tuesdays now, sometimes Thursdays. Once, a Friday evening, when we were mid-film and the room was warm and comfortable, he slipped out to the kitchen with his phone and didn't come back for 40 minutes. I heard his voice through the door, low, measured, the particular tone of a person choosing words with care. When he returned, he sat back down beside me, refilled his wine glass, and resumed watching the film as though the 40-minute gap had not occurred. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Fine," he said. "She's been anxious about her boiler." I nodded. I filed it away. I was in the thick of a systems migration at work during those months, a brutal, all-consuming project that required most of my cognitive bandwidth from September through November, and I was honest with myself later about how much I had used that exhaustion as an excuse not to look too closely at things. It is easier, when you love someone and are tired, to give them the benefit of the doubt. It is easier to tell yourself that the draft from the window is just winter, not a warning. I chose easier, repeatedly, and I paid the price for it. What I remember most from those months is a particular quality of silence in the house. Not the comfortable silence of two people who are at ease, but something slightly different, slightly strained, like a musical note held fractionally too long. Marcus seemed to be thinking about something he wasn't sharing. He slept on his side of the bed without the casual, unconscious contact that had always been just part of how we occupied space together. He checked his phone more frequently. Once I came into the home office to ask something, and he closed his laptop screen in a single, practiced motion, then opened it again almost immediately and smiled at me. "Sorry," he said. "I was just mid-email." I said, "Of course," and went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a moment, listening to the radiator tick, telling myself nothing. I also need to tell you about one particular Sunday, because it was the last time I believed everything was normal, and I want to mark it properly, the way you mark the last day of something before you know it's ending. It was late October, 3 weeks after the transfer was made, though I did not know that yet. Diane came for Sunday lunch, arriving at noon exactly in her camel-colored wool coat, carrying wine and chrysanthemums she handed me with the slightly ceremonial air she brought to all small gestures. Lunch was the usual arrangement. She sat at Marcus's right, I sat opposite, and she talked in that particular way she had of filling every available silence so thoroughly that conversation became performance rather than exchange. She talked about the neighbors on her street, about Marcus's childhood. His childhood was a subject she returned to reliably, like a compass finding north, each anecdote deployed with the precision of someone establishing provenance. What I remember most is a moment near the end of lunch, when Diane set down her wine glass and looked at Marcus directly. Not at me, not at both of us, but at him alone, and said, "Things are moving along nicely, aren't they?" Not a question, a statement spoken in a tone so flat and private it clearly wasn't meant for my ears, even though I was seated 2 feet away. Marcus met her eyes for just a moment and said, "Let's not talk about that now, Mom." And Diane smiled and picked up her wine glass and looked at me with the bright, impenetrable pleasantness she deployed like a shield. "Claire, this chicken is wonderful," she said. "You must give me the recipe." I said thank you. I looked at my plate. I filed it away. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. A private family matter, finances perhaps, the boiler she'd mentioned. I told myself that couples have their private things, and families have their private things, and the two don't always need to intersect. I told myself all of this so smoothly and so quickly that I almost believed it. And I cleared the lunch plates, and later that evening, when Marcus put his arm around me on the sofa, I leaned into him the way I always had, and the house was warm, and the evening felt easy, and I chose, one last time, not to look. December arrived in the city the way it always does. Dark by 4 in the afternoon, everyone slightly grayer and more burdened, the streets smelling of cold air and takeaway. My work project was finally complete, and I had surfaced from 3 months of tunnel vision feeling like someone who had just come up from deep water. Slightly dazed, suddenly able to see the edges of things I hadn't had the bandwidth to examine before. I noticed the stack of unopened posts on Marcus's home office desk. I noticed that the Home Improvement magazine had been on the kitchen counter for several days in a position too deliberate to be accidental. Not dropped, not abandoned, but placed, as though something inside it were meant to be found, or as though someone had simply been careless. The morning I found the receipt, I had not been looking for anything. I want to be precise about this because it matters. I was making coffee on a Thursday morning in December, the cafetiere on the counter, the gray light coming through the kitchen window. Marcus already gone. He left at 7:30 every morning, kiss on the cheek, coat and briefcase, the door closing with a sound as familiar as breathing. The magazine was in the way of where I wanted to set my mug. I moved it. The paper slipped out from between the pages and landed face up on the kitchen tile, directly under the overhead light, in the manner of things that have been waiting. I picked it up automatically. I read it the way you read anything that appears in front of you unexpectedly, without preloading it with meaning, just processing the words in sequence. Transfer confirmation, date, October 14th, from account number ending 7742. I knew that number. That was the joint savings account, our account, the one we had both signed for at the bank on a gray spring afternoon 6 years ago with matching pens and a sense of something being built. Amount $190,000 to account registered to D. Hargreaves, Diane Hargreaves, his mother. I read it 3 times. The 3rd time, I held the paper up closer to the light, as though proximity might change the words. It did not. I stood in my kitchen, barefoot on the cold tile, and felt the particular stillness that descends when something irreversible has just occurred. Not noise, not immediate grief, but a flat, crystalline quiet, the way a room sounds after a glass has finished breaking. The receipt was dated October 14th. I had asked Marcus in November if anything was on his mind. He had said, "Just work." He had been standing next to me at the kitchen sink, and our shoulders were almost touching, and he had looked at me with those calm, familiar eyes and said nothing that was true. My hands were very still. I remember noticing that specifically. I had expected them to shake, and they didn't, and that stillness scared me more than any trembling would have. I set the receipt down on the counter with the same care I would use for something that might shatter. Then I picked up my phone, and with a steadiness that surprised even me, I called the only person I trusted absolutely. My father answered on the second ring. "Dad," I said. My voice was quiet and very level, and that levelness scared me more than any trembling would have. "I need you to come over. Something has happened. Please don't ask me on the phone. Just come." There was a brief pause, and then my father, who has always understood the difference between questions that need asking and ones that don't, said simply, "I'm leaving now." I hung up and stood in my kitchen in the December light, the receipt in front of me, the coffee going cold behind me, and I thought about all the Sundays, all the closed kitchen doors, all the 40-minute phone calls and the fractional pauses and the laptop screen snapping shut, and the draft from the window that I had called winter when it was never winter at all. 3 months. He had known for 3 months, and every single morning, without fail, he had kissed me on the cheek and walked out the door. My father arrived in 34 minutes. I know the exact time because I watched the clock on the kitchen wall for every one of those minutes, standing with the receipt on the counter in front of me and the cold coffee beside it, not moving, not calling anyone else, not crying. I was not ready to cry yet. I was in the particular state that precedes grief, the state of extreme clarity, where every detail of your surroundings becomes hyper-vivid and faintly absurd, the way the world looks just before a storm. I noticed the chip in the tile near the back door that we had been meaning to fix for 2 years. I noticed that Marcus had left his reading glasses on the windowsill. I noticed that the refrigerator hummed at a slightly different pitch than usual, or perhaps I simply had never paid enough attention before to know what its usual pitch was. My father knocked twice and came in through the back door the way he always did, the way families do when a house has been visited enough times that ceremony falls away. He was in his weekend clothes, a gray wool jumper, his reading glasses on top of his head where he always put them when he was in a hurry, and he looked at me the way he had always looked at me when something was wrong, with a directness that bypassed politeness entirely, the look of a man who had spent 40 years as a structural engineer and understood, perhaps better than most, the importance of assessing damage before deciding what could be saved. I handed him the receipt without speaking. He read it. He read it again. Then he set it on the counter and looked up at me, and the expression on his face was not surprise. That was the thing I had not expected. It was not surprise. "Dad," I said slowly, "you don't look shocked." He was quiet for a moment in the way he is quiet when he is choosing what to say. Then he sat down at the kitchen table and folded his hands and told me that he had received a phone call 6 weeks earlier from an old colleague, a man who worked at the same bank where our savings account was held, not in a position of direct access, but someone who had seen enough over the years to be uncomfortable with what he knew. He had not called to report anything specific. He had called my father because they were old friends, and because he had known me since I was 12, and because he had simply wanted to say, quietly, carefully, without naming names, that it might be worth checking on certain arrangements. My father had been trying to verify first, to be certain before he caused damage that might be irreparable, and had been deciding what to do when I called him that morning. He looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "I'm sorry, Claire." I should have told you sooner. I thought I was protecting you." I sat down. I took the receipt and looked at it one more time. Then I said, "Tell me everything you know." What he told me took 20 minutes, and by the end of those 20 minutes, the world I had been living in for 9 years had been quietly and thoroughly dismantled. It was not just the $190,000 bonus. My father's contact had flagged a pattern of transfers. Smaller amounts, $3,000 and $4,000 and $5,000 at a time, moved over the previous 18 months from the joint account to an account traced with some difficulty to a holding company registered in Diane's name. The smaller transfers totaled just over $34,000. The joint account, which I had last checked in September with the comfortable proprietorial satisfaction of a woman who trusted her own household, was almost entirely drained. I pressed my hands flat on the kitchen table and stared at the wood grain and counted to 10. I breathed. I said, "Is there anything else?" My father hesitated. "There may be something related to the house," he said. "I haven't been able to confirm it yet." I stood up. I walked to the home office. I opened the filing cabinet and began to look. It took me 11 minutes to find it. It was behind the mortgage folder inside a plain manila envelope with no label, the kind of envelope that would be invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking. Inside was a document I had never seen, a transfer of beneficial interest form, partially completed, relating to the property at our address on Aldermore Lane. The document named Marcus as transferring party and Diane Hargreaves as beneficiary. It had been drafted by a solicitor. Marcus had signed the bottom of the first page. The form was not completed. The second signature line, which required mine, was blank, but it had been prepared. It had been prepared and filed away, and presumably was waiting for something, waiting for a moment, waiting for me not to notice. My father stood in the doorway and watched me read it. I held the paper in both hands, and then I put it very carefully on the desk and stood still for a long moment with my back to him, looking out the window at the garden. Our garden, with its chaos of old roses and the stone path Marcus had laid himself 2 summers ago, crouching in the August sun with a level and a bag of cement, looking satisfied in the way he rarely did. I had brought him a beer. He had squinted up at me and smiled. I thought about that afternoon with a precision that felt like grief and like anger in equal, inseparable measure. Then I turned around and said, "I need a solicitor, today." Marcus came home at 6:15, exactly when he always did. I heard the key in the lock, the particular sound of the door opening and closing, the soft thud of his briefcase in the hallway. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my hands folded and the receipt and the manila envelope in front of me. My father was seated to my left. We had spent the afternoon on the phone with a solicitor named Patricia, a woman my father's accountant had recommended, brisk and extremely competent, who had listened to everything and said, with no particular drama, "Don't touch anything. Don't move any accounts. Don't have the conversation without knowing your rights first." We had spoken for 90 minutes. I knew my rights. Marcus came into the kitchen and stopped. He looked at me. He looked at my father. He looked at the papers on the table. And in the fraction of a second between stopping and speaking, I saw it. The thing I had been looking for across 9 years of small, filed-away incidents. The thing that had always been there beneath the composure and the practiced gentleness. I saw that he had been waiting for this moment too, not with relief, but with the particular resignation of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally put it down. "Claire," he said. "Sit down, Marcus," I said. He sat down. He did not look at my father. He looked at the papers, then at me, and said, "I can explain." "I'm sure you can," I said. "I want to hear it." What followed was one of the most extraordinary hours of my life, not because of any dramatic revelation, but because of the way truths can be delivered in the language of justification and still land like blows. Marcus explained that his mother had been in financial difficulty. He explained that she had been facing a shortfall after a bad investment, something he had helped arrange, a detail he delivered quietly and without meeting my eyes, and that she had come to him in September, frightened, and that he had not been able to watch her lose the house she had lived in for 30 years. He explained that he had intended to replace the money once the bonus came through. He explained that the beneficial interest document was just a precaution. He explained that he had never intended to deceive me. He had only intended to solve the problem quietly because he knew. He said this part carefully, with the air of a man offering honesty as though it were a gift, that I would have objected. "You're right," I said when he had finished. "I would have objected, because it was my money too." "Our money," he said. "No," I said. "You made that distinction for me when you moved it without telling me. You decided it was yours to give. You decided it for 9 years of savings that I deposited every month, Marcus, because we agreed that we were building something together." I stopped. I breathed. I kept my voice level. "How much did you tell her about the house?" He went very still. "How much?" I said again. "Did you tell Diane about the beneficial interest document?" "That was only a contingency." "It was a document transferring partial ownership of my home to your mother," I said. "It had your signature on it. The only thing missing was mine. Were you going to ask me, or were you going to find another way?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever sat inside. My father looked at the table. Marcus looked at me. I looked at the ruins of 9 years laid out in 2 pieces of paper, and I waited. "She said," Marcus began, then stopped. "She said what?" He rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man who has run out of ways to make something smaller. "She said if I couldn't secure the house as collateral, she'd have to sell hers, and she'd have nowhere to go." He looked up. "I couldn't let her. She's my mother, Claire." "She is your mother," I said. "And I am your wife. And you chose to protect her finances by taking mine, without asking, without telling me, for 18 months. And then you sat across from me at this table and let me talk about our future, and you kissed me goodbye every morning, and you said nothing." I paused. The pause was not for effect. It was because the next sentence needed to be the truest one. "When were you going to tell me? When the form was signed? When the house was gone?" He had no answer. He sat across from me with his hands on the table and his eyes somewhere below the surface of things. And for the first time, I understood that his silence had never been about protecting me. It had been about protecting himself from having to make a choice he had already made. "I want you to stay somewhere else tonight," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. Slowly, the nod of a man who had no argument left. And he stood, and he went upstairs, and I heard the sounds of him packing a bag with the quiet efficiency of someone who had perhaps, on some level, been half prepared for this. The door closed. The house was very still. My father put his hand over mine on the kitchen table. He did not say anything. He did not need to. I drove to Diane's house the following afternoon alone. I had not told anyone I was going. Not my father, not Patricia, not Marcus, who had sent me 3 text messages from his hotel that I had not answered. I went because there was a conversation that needed to happen face to face, while I still had the particular quality of cold clarity that I knew would not last forever. These things melt eventually. I wanted to use it while it was still hard. Diane answered the door in a cream blouse and reading glasses, and the expression of a woman who has been waiting. Not for me, specifically, but for a version of this moment, which she had perhaps always known was coming. She looked at me with something that was almost respect. "Claire," she said, "I was wondering when you'd come." "Then you know why I'm here," I said. "Come in. I'll make tea." "I don't want tea," I said. "I want you to tell me, to my face, when you decided to do this." She removed her glasses and folded them and said, I decided when I understood that Marcus would never put his family first as long as you had a financial hold on him. She said it with the flat certainty of a prepared statement. I want my son to be secure. That house should have been in the family from the start. That house, I said slowly, is mine. My name is on the deed. My salary is in the mortgage. You know this. I know what a solicitor can argue, she said. And there it was. I had suspected something like this, but hearing it spoken aloud, in her ordinary living room, in the smell of furniture polish and dried flowers in the afternoon light, was still something. She was not ashamed. She had planned this with the same methodical patience she brought to everything, and she was looking at me with the calm of someone who believed, even now, that she held the better hand. I took out my phone. I showed her a photograph of the court application Patricia had filed that morning, a freezing order on all assets associated with the named accounts, pending investigation. I watched her face as she read it. I watched the small, careful recalibration happening behind her eyes. Not panic, but the first crack in the composure of a person who has just understood that the situation is not what she thought it was. This is a family matter, she said, and her voice was fractionally less certain. It was, I said. When Marcus moved the first $3,000 in June of last year, it was a family matter. When it became $224,000 taken without consent, it became a legal one. I put my phone away. Patricia has also been in contact with your solicitor regarding the beneficial interest document. There is a paper trail from his office to Marcus's email to your address. The term being considered is conspiracy to defraud. I let that sit in the air for a moment. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to tell you personally that I want every cent returned, and I want the beneficial interest document formally withdrawn in the time frame Patricia has specified. If that happens, the matter stays civil. If it doesn't, I picked up my bag, you'll hear from her office. She sat down. Not dramatically. She simply sat, and for the first time in 9 years of Sunday lunches and paper-cut smiles, she looked her actual age. I never meant for it to go this far, she said. But it did, I said, and you knew it might. I walked to the door. Goodbye, Diane. I walked to my car and I drove home. The weeks that followed were not easy, and I want to be honest about that. Because stories that end with someone walking out a door into clean, uncomplicated light are not quite true. There were calls with Patricia that lasted 90 minutes and cost money I resented spending on a problem I hadn't created. There were mornings I woke at 3 and lay in the dark of the house listening to the absence of another person's breathing, feeling something complicated that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief, but lived in the territory between them. There were evenings I walked into the kitchen and the magazine was still on the counter, and I had to physically move it to a different room because I could not yet throw it away, which told me something about myself that I spent a lot of time sitting with. Marcus returned the money. Not immediately. There were legal wheels and a negotiation in which Patricia was crisp and utterly unmoved by his solicitor's attempts to characterize the transfers as a misunderstanding. But it came back in 2 transfers over 6 weeks, along with a formal withdrawal of the beneficial interest document and a written acknowledgement that I read in Patricia's office with a detached thoroughness I had not known I was capable of. Diane's solicitor faced a professional conduct review that resulted in a formal reprimand. The criminal route was not pursued. Patricia advised that financial recovery was the priority and the civil path was cleaner. But the paper trail existed, and the review existed, and both of them would continue to exist for a long time. Marcus and I are divorced now. It was not dramatic. It was paperwork and appointments, and one final conversation in Patricia's offices where he sat across from me with the diminished quality he had worn since that kitchen evening and said that he was sorry, and I said that I believed him, and then we both signed the things that needed signing. The house is mine. It was always mine. I repainted the hallway in February. a warm ivory that felt like a decision entirely my own, made in a room that belongs entirely to me. The roses in the garden came back this spring. They always do, regardless of what the winter does to everything above ground. I have been drinking my coffee on the back step in the mornings, which is something I never used to do. Marcus had always said the step was too cold, and I had agreed the way you agree with people you love about small, unimportant things. The step is not too cold. It is actually exactly the right temperature for a person who has learned the difference between choosing warmth and simply tolerating a draft. My father comes on Sundays now. We have learned to make proper coffee together, arguing comfortably about the ratio, and he always brings something. Bread sometimes, or a newspaper, or occasionally just himself, which is more than enough. Last Sunday he sat beside me on the back step and we watched a pair of pigeons argue over the bird bath, and he said without preamble, "You did everything right." I thought about that for a moment, looking at the roses climbing back up the old fence, their refusal to be anything other than what they were, season after season, regardless of the weather. Then I thought about the kitchen table and the paper in my still hands and the cold clarity that had turned out to be not fear, but the truest and most precise form of self-respect I had ever managed. "I know," I said. And for the first time in a very long time, I meant it without reservation. The money was never the point. The money was just the measure of what he had decided I was worth, a number on a transfer receipt, a blank line waiting for a signature. What I took back was not the $190,000. What I took back was the version of myself who had known all along that the draft from the window was not winter. She had been there the whole time, patient as those roses, waiting for me to stop calling the cold, something it wasn't, and finally come home.